of sensing danger, reacting to danger, and alerting others to danger. They didn't know quite what predator might be lurking in the bush or attacking them, but they would probably have developed some sort of squeal that meant very dangerous animal, and that this composite image actually, and he goes into a very sophisticated argument as to how this all occurred, was in our brains for millions of years, and that it manifests itself, this brain dragon, in art and in primarily art and architecture at certain times of cultural stress. So that for him, the image of St. George piercing the neck of the dragon, that dragon goes all the way back to the early Pleistocene, and it represents danger and threat of whatever kind.
Love this. As you're seeing already, we're tying in so much of what has already happened, what ended up getting hardwired into our brains, and then how it shapes us. And we'll get to more of that coming up next hour. Before we do, though, we got to wrap up with the other threats, the other people that are the other creatures that are part of the usual suspects from the Pleistocene era. So we'll talk about the big fish, and we'll talk about the big snakes. How big did those snakes get? And we'll talk about the teratorns and condors before we talk about how we got shaped by and eagles too. The eagles that are our national symbol. Maybe our ancestors wouldn't have used those as our national symbol. They might have held a grudge. We'll get to all that coming up next. Deadly powers that shaped us next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Yeah, we'll get back to that. Coming up in just a few minutes, we'll talk more with Dr. Paul Trout about our current mythology and how it's been shaped by our years as prey. And that to this day, still around the world, we're still prey. Even in parts of this country, as Paul said, where you have to be very careful when you go out or you'll end up being prey. And it's much more part of our psychology. It is a formative force. And we're talking about how mainstream anthropology, maybe even psychology, doesn't give enough credit to our ancestors as having been survivors of being prey. They didn't walk on to the center stage of human history as apex predators. It took a long time, and we'll talk more about some of those predators. We'll wrap up our conversation about giant snakes, giant fish, and giant birds coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So, Dr. Paul Trout, we're just going to wrap up some of the other major mega predators of the Pleistocene era that we think, and you've convinced me, it's still lurking in our hard wiring, in our psyche, that we are this close to always end up being meat. And even that realization itself, I think, is something which every human goes through. Just sort of like, oh my God, we're meat too. We're meat for somebody else, even though we aren't raised to think that way. So let's talk about the giant snakes of the Pleistocene, because we still have big snakes on the planet, but nothing like what they used to be like.
It's sort of still debatable how big they grew, because their particular bones, their skeletal remains are hard to find preserved because they're so fragile. But there was a finding in Egypt, and the snake skeleton measured 42 to 65 feet long. It's a little hard to know how much of it was compressed and found, but at any rate, between 42 and 65 feet long, which, when fleshed out, would mean that snake had a diameter of 18 inches and probably weighed 800 pounds.
Oh, my God.
Now, there are also reports from Roman armies of encountering huge snakes. Now, whether these can be credited or not is certainly debatable, but they were so huge that, one, they killed a number of soldiers until the soldiers devised battering rams and other devices they'd use on forts to kill it with huge stones. So we've got the feeling that at one time the snakes, pythons, anacondas, boa constrictors, who I'm talking about, were immense. And we still, that might explain the especially frightening mystique that surrounds these creatures. We know that primates have a visceral fear of them, and we probably have something still left of that in our own head. In Mexico and Central America, they mythologize these creatures in huge, hundreds of gigantic stones carved in the form of snakes. And what's really interesting to me is that they are usually shown with open jaws, inside of which is a human head. This has now often been interpreted as the shaman emerging from the snake or wearing a snake skin. And that may be true to some extent, but I think it also captures the very practical realization that we often went down the throat of those snakes, and
right.
Maybe a few escaped and lived to tell about it.
Well, but it's interesting that you should mention, I mean, the relationship between ancient creatures and then mythology. And I know this touches on a sore subject for some people, but I do think it's interesting that we think of in Western Judeo-Christian culture, for that matter, Islam, that the discussion about the serpent, about that it was a snake, which was our adversary from the very beginning, and would be the something which was the adversary, especially for women, as laid out in the book of Genesis, and how that in other cultures it wasn't going to be a snake. It might have been a bear, or it might have been a jackal, or it might have been something else. But in our creation story, it's a snake. Well, hell, if they're 65 feet long. That probably explains. I mean, and they're silent killers too, which is the other part of this. Is so many of these beasts that you talk about, they don't give you any warning. There was no way of telling that, and suddenly you were alive and then you weren't, or suddenly you were there and then you were gone.
Python attacks on infants and children in Southeast Asia today are said to be almost too numerous to recount individually. So there is a very lively fear and a very grounded fear of these creatures. And I think you're right there. We even find some myths in the Arctic region that posit a dangerous agent or a devil-like creature that is a serpent, where they could never have seen one, and yet somehow that image is in their mythology.
Yeah, very interesting. So then we add on that all of the attacks, that can happen from the trees, from the ground, from the water, and to go back to it, from the air, because these giant condors, these eagles, these teratons, these could carry away a human being. And we were smaller back then, right? I mean, we know that we weren't quite as heavy as we are, or as tall as we are as a species, but our ancestors could easily be carried away.
Yes, they could. I have an image in the book comparing the size of a human and then an eagle, a condor, and a teratorn, which is now an extinct bird. It was called monster bird, Teratornis, monster bird. And these were the bodies. They weighed 50 pounds, had huge wingspans, and they could lift people right off the ground. And what's interesting is we must assume that these were very dangerous predators of our early ancestors, because even in reduced form today, eagles are very dangerous predators of apes and monkeys that live in Africa. They can hit them with such force, 5,000 feet, impact of about 5,000 miles per hour, computed to be 5,000 miles per hour. They can hit them. They can hit them so hard that the talons literally go through the creature and circle out in front of the creature. And so if this is still going on today in Africa, if predators are still, these avian predators are still taking their toll of primates, well, they certainly must have done so in the Pleistocene. And in fact, we do have a skull or two that do show the holes made by a eagle-like predator.
Yeah, and then and the giant fish. So even there, we're trying to wrestle ourselves some grub, or do we become grub for somebody else?
That's right. Sharks, of course, and barracuda, and I don't put in piranha, but they certainly also were a threat. But these large fish, I even have a section devoted to the grouper, which I never thought would have been a predator. I only liked them as sandwiches, and they grew to be as large as 2,000 pounds, and we do know of, in fact, attacks of groupers on divers. We have those recorded. Right. So whenever we went near a river, any body of water, and we did, we obviously had to get from island to island. We colonized the world, and we were in danger of being killed by these predators, and of course by other kinds of sea creatures, which are not technically predators, but would have been certainly large enough to swamp any sort of boat.
Right. Opportunistic. So from that, we get this, that we know that there were many fewer, not surprisingly, maybe just a few thousand of our ancestors existed at a time, and that we were pretty close to maybe getting wiped out completely. How many years ago are we talking about for the population to have been that small?
Well, that's a good question. That was a hypothesis advanced by an archaeologist named Hiram Hayden, and he thought that the evidence was that probably 1 million so years ago, the population of the planet of Homo sapien or Homo erectus would be about 7,000.
7,000.
7,000. So we were in danger of going the same route as Australopithecus, and that is being eliminated by other predators, whether they were, in the case of Australopithecus, other humans or hominins or predators, but more disease and other factors, right. Of course.
But there was a point where we can say somewhere there was a tipping point in our favor. And it might have been, the greater development of our brains? It might have been just we got more clever than the other hominids that were there?
Oh, well, that's the key point.
Right.
We were essentially in an arms race with predators. They had developed, of course, for millions of years before there was anything like a bipedal primate. They had developed extraordinary hunting and killing skills. And when we went into their environment, we had to develop our own techniques for dealing with the threat these predators posed to us. And we certainly brought into that environment very valuable technology, to put it that way, from the primate line. We had advanced predator detection skills. We had a hardwired defense system. It's called survival strategies. I call them also fear management strategies. That is, we knew what to do immediately in a crisis, and we also developed then our own techniques through culture to deal with the threat and the fear created by the threat.
Very interesting. Again, we're talking with Paul Trout. Deadly Powers is the name of the book, and it speaks to the theory that we were much more shaped by being prey than we were predators. And this goes back then to perhaps to all sorts of weird things that we can't quite explain about ourselves. But in an odd kind of way, it sort of mimics some of the ways in which we were treated as prey. For example, the concept of overkill. Can you talk about that? What is that? What do we learn from our ancestors that explain overkill?
Well, animals do engage in overkill. There are recorded instances, for an example, of barracuda just chomping into schools of small fish without eating them, just to kill them. Some sort of bloodlust. And there are also examples of large birds coming down and killing off whole flocks of birds for no other reason than to kill them. And other occasions where we see that animals engage in overkill. And what's being triggered there, it's hard to say, but there apparently is sometimes just some pleasure in letting loose certain hardwired predatory instincts and in enjoying the consequences. Now, if we're talking about humans engaging in the overkill of animals, I think that this is a sort of, I don't develop this in the book, but it's a sort of reflex revenge on our position of being fearful prey animals.
We'll show you. It's sort of almost like puffing up our chests and beating our chests in front of these beasts.
Yes. I think the overkill, particularly of predators such as tigers and leopards and lions and in Asia, was really that sort of puffing up. We said, okay, we have become the dominant predator now of the planet when we are armed. When we're not armed, we go right back to our Pleistocene role as prey. But at any rate, when we are well armed or sitting on top of elephants with high-powered rifles, it was indeed a sort of revenge on these creatures.
I thought that was fascinating, and in the same way, it mimics how, as you mentioned, like in the case of the lions and tigers that are known to go and kill hundreds of human beings, and that we have this. This isn't in the archaeological record. This is in the newspapers of the last 50, 60 years. Of these lions that would go rogue or tigers that would go rogue, and they may not even eat their prey. No. They just wanted to kill. They just wanted to kill humans, as many humans as they can get their hands on, or paws, as it were. So in what other ways, then, do you see us as human beings today as being the inheritors of a prey psychology, not a predator psychology?
Well, we developed a exquisite fear system that allowed us to survive. But at a certain point, in our evolution, we also developed, and I think in part thanks to our arms race with predators, an ability to imagine things. I call it the mythic imagination. Others call it the creative imagination. And they're roughly the same, but we eventually developed enough brain power to create predators of the imagination, to exaggerate the features of animal predators that terrified us and into monsters, so that the monster becomes a animal predator writ large, but having other kinds of traits that makes it even more dangerous. And we believed in these monsters, and I give the reasons for how they emerged from both natural and cognitive developments. But we began to, in a sense, terrorize ourselves because of this imagination, which I point out because it creates monsters, is something of a monstrous imagination itself. And we became tormented by the ability to proliferate monsters of the imagination. And this led to the need to deal with this fear that we were creating and exaggerating. And that led to the mythification of these animal predators and their mythic descendants, the mythic predator, in four dominant ways, and I really have not yet found a fifth way. We mythologize them as monsters, and by doing that, we also created monster fighters. We controlled the monster we were creating in part by creating the hero whose role it was to kill the monster, to battle the monster, and subdue the monster.
And we'll get to more of that coming up. That's such an interesting point about why it is that we still have battles between heroes and monsters next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Oh, keeps you running. If I were trying to sleep during this show, I'd be like, my little feet would be moving like my dog Jacula's in his sleep. He just like when he's chasing cars in his dreams, or very likely chasing squirrels in his dreams, because that's my dog, Jacula the vampire dog. By the way, Jacula the vampire dog on sale. Great for Christmas gift giving. Hint, hint. It's been a great fundraiser. We use it in the state of Minnesota, raising money to help dog rescue in remote parts of the state where, sadly, there are a lot of puppy mills. And they kick these dogs out just out on their own. They either survive or they don't. And many of them don't. Plus, there's just a lot of people that have stray dogs that they feed and then they stop feeding, and it's just a tragedy that can be avoided. So that's what the profits from this book have been going to mostly, is to this group called Red Lake Rosie's Rescue in outstate Minnesota. But also, you can buy the book in Colorado, and the same sort of thing. There's an animal rescue group there that benefits from that. If you're in Denver, in the Denver area, Chuck and Don's has copies of Jacula the vampire dog, and I think copies of my other book too, Dizzy Them Up with the Propeller Butt. But if you're looking to give a gift for Christmas, you can also Google it and find it online too, and any way you want to do it, it's great. All right, so thank you for letting me sneak in that plug. It's all for a good cause, and this idea too of vampires and werewolves and monsters, we create them and then we fight them because of our years as prey. Next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. So I was talking with Dr. Paul Trout, who's a retired professor of English from Montana State University, about the connection between our mythology and our years as prey, not as a predator, but as a victim, as something that ran in fear, and something, and a species which still does. Where if it weren't for our technology, who knows where we would be when it comes to the predators of the earth, and it's all described in the book Deadly Powers. Fascinating. So going back to the earliest cave paintings, where some people look at that and they say, well, it's just a simple history of a kill, that this is just, some sort of rudimentary illustration of storytelling that was going on at the fire, and it was all about the kill. But I think you unpack that a little differently in Deadly Powers, and I find that interesting.
Well, I'm glad you do. I think it is a little different than reflecting our time as the hunter. And certainly some of those cave paintings that I've seen do reflect a hunting culture. But there are also panels that are devoted to imaging the predator. And it's almost as if these lions, and the lion panel, for an example, that are gazing not towards the person looking at the panel, but gazing out probably at prey animals, may have been our way of trying to capture their power as hunters. And that's one of the points that I make in the book, that indeed it was by watching predators at work that we started to internalize a desire to be a predator, as well as learn from them how to be a good predator as a hunter.
Right. And I'm one who finds it very easy to relate to monster stories, love monster stories. I'm rarely scared by them, but in a way, there's an expression I learned in seminary that nobody's more obsessed with sex than the Puritan. And so I find that to be kind of oddly fascinating, that we obsess with the thing that we deny ourselves the most, maybe. And in the case of this, I love monsters, and yet I'm never scared by them. I mean, or I just don't, I go to monster movies and I'm never scared by them, and I always want to be scared by them. So what is that? I was trying to look for insight on that based on your theory, and I'm trying to come to grips with my obsession with that, and whether it speaks to something inside of me that wants to be prey again. Do I want to go back to being predated, as it were?
Well, there are a couple things going on there, I think, Ian. To go back to what I was saying before the break about the monstrous imagination, and that might help answer that, in part, that the question that you just asked. There was a point when and there's theories about when this happened and why it happened, and I do cover those in the book, but we certainly developed the ability to create monsters that is counterfactual and counterintuitive creatures that were really animal predators writ large. Monsters, in essence, eat us. They also frighten us, but they eat us. Well, we were able, for both good and bad, to create these through the imagination, through the mythic imagination. And we, in a sense, when we did this, we added to our torments. We inflicted these fears upon us, and I talk I give a couple examples of cultures that were literally undone by their fervid mythic imaginations. The Inuit, for an example, created so many monsters lurking in their environment that they couldn't explore their environment to find fish and game animals. And that then when Europeans came into the area to compete for the food, they had an upper hand because they had no such fears about going into this lake or that lake, whereas the Inuit were terrified. And some people at the time even commented on the handicapping fears that they had. The Japanese at one time went through the same thing, and the government had to forbid them from talking about ghost tales because they were adding to their fears. There were other examples in culture of the mythic imagination running amok. The problem with the mythic imagination, it has no built-in rheostat, one might say, that creates a sort of a healthy number of, or a therapeutic number of monsters in order for us to sort of vent our fears through them. It simply proliferates them. There's no way of stopping them. And and what I suggest in the book is that sometimes there was a sort of awareness in us that this was happening to us, and that the monstrous imagination created monsters in a way to deal with its own creation of monsters. So it created, what's interesting about monsters, and this may be tying into what your own reactions, is that although monsters are enormous and incredibly voracious in every way our superiors, almost all the time they are, or at least can be, subdued by clever and often very imaginative heroes and tricksters. So it's as if the monstrous imagination was working on itself to control itself by imagining not monsters, but heroic, imaginative characters who could indeed deal with the production of monsters from the mythic imagination. And of course, I focus on two, and I think that pretty much covers the territory. That is the mythic hero who battles the monster, Heracles, the hero twins of Popol Vuh, Gilgamesh, Sigurd, Sigmund. Every culture has an assortment of heroic figures who are mythic, who have the power to subdue and kill in all kinds of ways the monsters that the imagination is creating. And then I also talk about the other mythic character, the mythic trickster, whose job sometimes is to kill the monster, sometimes by tricking him, gaining entrance into its body but packing in a couple of knives so that when it is swallowed by the monster, it can cut the heart or carve its way out of the monster. But sometimes simply outsmarting the monster to make it enfeeble, to wear it out, as in sometimes the stories of Wildcat and Great Rabbit, where Great Rabbit leads Wildcat on all kinds of chases until Wildcat expires from exhaustion. So it's yes, we are intrigued by monsters, but we're so fearful of them that we create human agents or human-like agents that can deal with our monstrous spirit to keep it at bay.
Do you watch modern movies? I mean, do you go to the theater a lot?
I do.
Okay. If that motif of the hero going inside the monster and killing it from the inside out is used all the time. It's the ending of the original Men in Black with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones.
That's right.
It's in the movie Hellboy, which I like the comic book genre, and they use that same idea in Hellboy. And that idea of going into the beast, coming in armed, and killing the beast from the inside out. It's such an ancient, sort of literary turn in these hero stories. And every time it starts, I'm like, oh, I can't believe they're going to use this again. But I'm almost like every 5 or 6 years, somebody uses that again. And I think that is so interesting that keeps coming back as being a way of getting out of these conflicts between the heroes and the monsters.
I speculate that this motif in going into the belly of the beast, as I put it, may have actually sprung from experiences where, for an example, a python grabs a village member. Now, this is going to be a very slow and very noisy kill. The python will be ingesting this person gulp by gulp as the person screams and fights. It might have been there may have been many cases where villagers rallied to defend the person and pull him out of the belly of the beast, so to speak. And we also have cases where primates have rescued their own from the coils in the mouth of large snakes, sometimes even from the clutches of a crocodile. So that may have been sort of the beginning of this mythic motif.
Yeah, very interesting. Again, we're talking about deadly powers, how we were shaped, how our mythology, how even our pop culture is all shaped from our years of having been prey. And this comes up all the time in commercials, in movies. Our need to try to dominate a monster or the monster within us. And that brings us back to kind of the whole werewolf and vampire thing. Werewolves obviously are super huge right now, along with vampires, because of the Twilight series. And it's a whole new generation of people finding this balance between the civil and the monstrous.
Well, in Chapter 9, I deal with another way we have incarnated the animal predator in a mythic form, and is a way of dealing with our continual fear of these creatures. And I call it the animal predator's model of menace. And I think this is what I will be speaking to, what you just said about the vampires and ghouls and our need to sort of identify with them. Well, I actually believe that is a very important development in our psyche, because we finally realize that one of the best ways of dealing with our fear of predators was to become the predator, was to, in some way, embody the power of the predator, the power to kill of a predator. And by doing that, we surmounted our fears and became the cause of fears in others. So we literally began to impersonate the predator, to bring it inside our person. And I think it first manifested itself as a strategy for hunting. We realized that to survive, we had to hunt, and that the best hunters, the greatest role models, were the animal predators, particularly the big cats. And we dressed like, we wore their pelts as we hunted, and we hunted in packs like them, and we slowly internalized their power to kill. And then we ritualized this in all kinds of transformative ceremonies where we would initiate young boys into a new life as indeed a predator, a killer of, let's say, pigs or whatever, but also a defender of the tribe and therefore a killer of other human beings. And these, I talk about these rituals in my book because they often involve the elders of the tribe dressing up as animal predators and attacking the initiates, sometimes quite violently, and hitting them, beating them, and growling at them, and to finally create a fearlessness within these young men, because they had to have that fearlessness to go out into the jungle to hunt and indeed to defend the tribe. And I point out that human sacrifice is explained in many ways, but it often takes the form of a predator kill. It was a way of telling ourselves that we had the power of the predator. So in Aztec culture, in fact, the sacrifices were often done in the name of the jaguar. The sacrifices would be dressed in jaguar skins. They would kill with obsidian knives shaped like a jaguar tooth. The hearts would be thrown into stone objects shaped like jaguars. They would be done in the name of the jaguar god. It was, it was a predator sacrifice. Was in a sense an imitation of a predator kill, and this took an extreme form in the African leopard men in the 19th century in Africa, where there was a cult of males who not only acted like predators, they thought they had become animal predators. They dressed like them. They wore gloves that had the shape
claws.
like with the claws of animal predators. They left tracks that were like animal predators. They weren't trying to blame the kills on the animal predators. They were trying to convince themselves that they had become animal predators. And
Deadly Powers, the name of the book, Paul Trout. We'll get your calls, we'll get your comments, your questions about our history as prey and how it shapes us today on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. All right, it's going to be a lively hour of your calls. Jump on in. We're talking about our history as prey, both today and how we're shaped by it in terms of our psyches, how we're wrapped around a kind of sense memory of being prey, and how we're still kind of working that out. And this is different from the way a lot of classic anthropologists look at this. There was I believe he said that it was Louis Leakey who said that we were never lunch, or humans were never on the menu, or some such. But it's just not true. And we have the archaeological record that says not only were we in massive numbers always being hunted and eaten, but the predators that we were up against were these ginormous killing machines. It's hard for us to think that it was like the Flintstones, where we had a saber-toothed tiger as a pet. Didn't happen. Even the dogs were gigantic dogs that traveled in packs of 50 and could wipe out whole villages, such as when villages were being formed. The idea of forming communities was to form a social group to fight off the predators, to try to survive. And that sticks with us to this day, and we'll get back to that conversation coming up in just a moment. Also, remember, we have these little online communities. We call them chat rooms. Coming up this Tuesday night, if you're a Coast insider, and why aren't you, go to coasttocoastam.com and figure out how easy and inexpensive that is, and all the benefits of being a Coast insider. But coming up this Tuesday night, I'll be on the chat. And I'll give you your first clue to a big announcement that's coming up next week. I may even tweet about that, too, during the week. Find out more. And be listening in the first hour next week. It'll be kind of fun. On Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. All right, so let's get to the phones right away. Thank you for waiting. Chuck in Alaska, west of the Rockies on Coast to Coast for Dr. Paul Trout. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, Paul and Ian, good to talk to you this evening. I've lived here in Alaska for 30 years, and I actually make my living buying and selling Pleistocene fossils, and I'm also an artist. As I speak, I'm carving a mammoth out of mammoth ivory. And I once had a short-faced bear skeleton and a skull that I sold for a gold miner, and it had been researched by a paleontologist. And my theory is that when the first humans that got here were almost like supermen. If you look at the early explorers that, the historic age, the French came in, were just incredible people. And we tend to look at history as man has been advancing, but just to survive and to come across here, what it would take, the senses and the wit, and like 6 of our 8 children are Alaska Native, and they're so much more intelligent than I am in certain areas. And it's just the way they're born. But like this short-faced bear was researched by a paleontologist, and it's this huge animal, but Dr. Paul Matthews at the university here came to the conclusion that he was not as much a predator as like a wolverine, who he had a huge nose and he could stand up real high. He could chase other animals off their kill. And I'm sure that people had to worry about things, but most of the material culture, these ancient cultures, was made out of stuff that didn't last, and I think they were a lot sharper and really incredible people. There's another comment I'd like to make, but
okay.
I'd like to hear.
Well, let's. Chuck, we got a lot of people to get through here, so let's just go ahead and get a response, if we can, from Dr. Trout on that. Go ahead.
Well, certainly there are arguments that bears were primarily herbivorous creatures, but if you look at Native American mythology, you'll find that they recognized that bears were dangerous creatures and that these creatures would eat them. And they both venerated and feared bears. And the bears caused Native Americans some kind of confusion, because these animals could stand up and walk on two legs. And that made Native Americans think that, well, we're kin to these bears, or these bears were once human, and they still bear these, excuse the pun, bear these traits from the time when humans and these animals interbred and interacted. So this meant that, indeed, the Native Americans had to give them more respect, but they feared them as predators. And I would just say the short-faced bear probably fell into that category as well. Now, as to your point about the resourcefulness of the people who came across the Bering Strait probably about 12, 14,000 years ago, they certainly had a lot of technology they were bringing with them, and a lot of information about animals, a really developed understanding of animals. And we have lost much of that understanding because we don't live with animals like these people did, and some people still do in some areas. I'm not quite sure I've responded adequately to your question, Chuck, but is that good enough now?
That's good. We just have so many people that want to get through, and I'll just remind people, put your best point up front, just in case we don't get to a list of points. And Gardner is in Cape Cod, east of the Rockies, on Coast to Coast for Dr. Paul Trout. Go ahead, Gardner.
Yeah, hi. I enjoy your ideas, mankind as thinking of himself as victim, even if unconsciously. And I have a question for you. Do you have any relationship to Velikovsky and his vision of man as caught in a post-traumatic stress as the result of physical and even cosmic catastrophes? And as a secondary question is, do you have any relationship to Carl Jung in his answer to Job when he talks about the plight of man as someone who is always eating and always being eaten?
Okay. That's good. That's a good response to this.
Well, I read Velikovsky, I think, back in 1960, and when was it? Not when worlds collide, but a collision of worlds or something like that, a long time ago. And I know a little bit about Jung, trying to find out if he could answer some of the question I had about the internalization of the inner monster. But I do talk a little bit about about the Stockholm syndrome, the feeling that we are sort of captives to powerful forces that have life and death control over us. And I introduced the Stockholm Syndrome to try to explain the psychology that led to the mythification of predators as gods and as divinities. Our ancient ancestors lived in a constant state of fear, but at the same time, they also recognized that predators often befriended them, or at least that was how it was seen, by leaving them meat, by not attacking them, and let's say by driving off other predators from their locale. And this was interpreted as gifts that were given by the predator to humans, but at the same time, this predator could turn on them and kill them. So it led to what I call a Stockholm Syndrome, which came from the case of people that were being held in a bank by two gunmen, and wound up actually identifying with the gunmen and defending them after they were released in the courts, so that they felt a kinship to them. And I felt that this might explain the kinship, the connectedness that we feel to predators that can both kill us and yet give us gifts.
Yeah, we give them their props in a way, maybe as a way to try to control them too. You mentioned the thing about, he said victims. And I don't know that, I mean, I know that we may be parsing words here, but I think there is a difference between thinking of ourselves as victims and thinking of ourselves as prey.
I think that's a good distinction. I don't think I ever used the word victims in my book, and it wasn't a conscious intent. It's that I didn't conceptualize the situation quite that way. We had resources, and we had to use those resources to avoid being a victim of a predator, of a kill. And that's how I sort of conceptualized it. Maybe some people see themselves as victims, but it's more that they just see themselves as being challenged to survive.
Well, but I think it brings up an interesting point. And again, it speaks to this idea of how we are today as having been shaped by our years as being prey, is that if somebody's attacked by a shark, we would say he's a victim of a shark attack. But part of that's based on the idea that we're the top of the food chain. And so if something like that happens to us, then we've become a victim, as opposed to he was prey. We don't think of ourselves as prey. We don't say, just another example of somebody today being prey. That would be horrifying to say that. That the crocodile got him because, we're all prey. And we just don't, that's not part of our mindset.
And I might add to that, too, the movies that deal with the characters being, let's say, victimized by crime. And in many of these movies, the protagonists don't become victims, they actually become the predators. For an example, in Death Wish, Paul Kersey turns the tables on the people who are victimizing him and becomes indeed a vigilante, and a very effective one. In the recent film Brave One, a woman who's lost her boyfriend from an attack of marauding street thugs goes out and becomes a vigilante and hunts them down. And in another film, while she was out, a woman who is terrified by a group of teenagers winds up turning the tables on them. So these characters and these movies don't depict these people as victims.
Let's get to Keith, Tampa, Florida, on Coast to Coast. Keith, you're talking with Dr. Paul Trout.
Hi, how are you, Ian? Great to talk to you again. And how are you, Paul?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Keith.
Happy Thanksgiving to both of you guys, and I hope you guys are doing well and everything's cool. My little take on that, and this is something that Ian pointed out a second ago. You were talking about the sharks. Basically, we have to realize one thing, is that we all live on the same planet, and there are certain laws that man has created that we abide by, that our civilization deals with. And in nature, they don't have to deal with those certain types of laws. And example, let's say a guy goes into the ocean and he goes swimming and he's attacked and killed by a shark or maimed or whatever. And automatically, like in the movie Jaws, the shark is immediately identified as the predator and as the aggressor and the killer. Whereas you have to realize something. My entire point is you're going into their world, and they don't have to live by your laws. They're there to eat, and they're there to survive, and they're not trying to kill you or anything. Dude, you just look good, man.
Well, I get that. I think that's the point, though, is that we often, when you say going into their world, part of what I think what Dr. Trout's getting at is the idea of it is still our world. It's not their world and our world. We're prey whenever we don't have our technological defenses, or whether we haven't thought something out enough. We're always this close to being lunch because that we are part of the same world. Fair enough?
I'd like to add something else to Keith's observation, and I think, Keith, you might like Chapter 8, because I discussed the predator as kin, friend, protector, and benefactor. And this is what I'm argue here is that we were so fearful when we had to go into the water with sharks and with crocodiles and alligators and all the other animals that live there, or indeed into the woods, that we created a mythology that tried to implicate these animals in our own social rules, our own social nexus. We tried to, but through totemism in particular, we tried to say, well, we're kin to these animals, and because we're kin to these animals owe us the same obligations that we owe each other as kin. So that it was a fear management strategy that was attempting to, well, it was a pretense, but it was one that they wanted to convince themselves of the reality of, that these animals were constrained by the same rules that constrained humans. And, of course, when they did go into the water and the animals did eat them up, we had to come up with a mythological interpretation of that, and which would be something like, well, this animal did not know that we were its kin, or this is a new animal that came into our area and did not know this, or it ate this person because this person had done something that violated the kinship laws against another alligator. So we did everything we could to try to avoid the practical knowledge that you have right there.
Glenda is in Wichita on Coast to Coast. Glenda?
Hello.
Hey.
You mentioned that you're discussing how our psychology is affected by all these eons of predation. Have I lost
Correct.
you?
Mm-hmm. No, okay. We're just waiting.
Okay, how do you stretch that to the point like Washington and Occupy Washington and big businesses with lawyers and little victims? How much of our, like rape, they say that's not sex, that's control. How much of our psyche is control and control E as a result of this?
Fair point. About control and control E as a result of having been shaped by predation.
Well, I'm not quite sure I can kind of answer that. I
think your friend Barbara Ehrenreich might have something to say about that. The woman who writes the foreword in your book, I bet you she would jump on that topic.
Glenda, let me see if I can approach this a slightly different way. In my book, I talk about the grounds of conflict between nations, and maybe the grounds of conflict between classes as well. and I said that it is, I see it as more growing out of a fear than out of hatred. And the fear is the fear of being consumed, or maybe of being controlled, but of being consumed. Nations often justify aggression by saying that the other nation is trying to take them over or consume their resources or whatever, control their culture. And so I suggest that it is not hatred, but a deep fear that may underlie a lot of international conflict. And sometimes then, I didn't talk about this, but perhaps even class conflict, the fear that some class is consuming more than it deserves, and that we are suffering, we are being absorbed by this class, and in a sense being consumed by it.
In an odd sort of way, that question reminded me of a Bible question I wanted to ask you about how we were shaped by predators. We'll get to that next, and all of y'all's calls too. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. If you ever would have encountered any of these 10-foot long, 750-pound killer cats like the Smilodon with 10-inch tusks, essentially, that would cut into your skull, or these 800-pound snakes, or these giant lizards, or these teratons, or these giant condors, run away. Or the small-faced bear, for that matter, too. Run away. Those first couple of chapters of Deadly Powers, truly harrowing. But it shows how we were shaped by being prey and not predators ourselves. Even the gift of fear, which we've only talked about a little bit, we'll get back to coming up in just a second. And then the rest of your calls for Dr. Paul Trout. Deadly Powers, Animal Predators, and the Mythic Imagination. You can link up to him at coasttocoastam.com. This is Ian Punnett. Well, Z Hero at my Twitter account, Deacon Punnett, sent in a question which I thought I want to address here real quickly about the kind of our ability to faint. That this is also a response to perhaps to fear and then to conflict. Where does fainting come into our human reaction of fainting in crisis, as you see it, Dr. Trout?
Well, we developed from the primate line, or within the primate line, survival strategies, or as I said, fear management strategies that involved 4 dominant physical reactions to imminent threat. One was freezing, and that involved sometimes an unconscious reaction of what they call terror paralysis, simply locking up. It's also called tonic immobility, and this reaction would be almost the first reaction upon seeing a predator looking at us, making eye contact with a predator who was staring at us with wide eyes. That was a fear trigger, and it's almost always meant this animal is sizing us up for an attack and to add to their diet. So fainting, I think, falls into that category because in some cases of terror paralysis, an animal that's actually in the jaws of a predator goes into a state of almost death-like state. It almost stops breathing, it stops moving, and it again, this cannot be a conscious thing. It's an
override,
almost. The reaction of the body to this terrible stress, and that is to encourage the predator to lose interest in it. And I've seen cases on Animal Planet where the predator will then drop the prey and look away, and the prey jumps up and takes off again.
Right. So it's a way of even fainting, perhaps, then, is just that same sort of lose interest in me. I'm part of the foliage. I'm not, I'm just look in another direction. Very interesting. Well, Thomas is in Florida on Coast to Coast. We're talking about how we were shaped as prey for tens of thousands of years. Thomas?
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my call.
Go ahead.
You've been articulating on many subjects, especially along the lines of ancient myths and creatures. When I was a young fellow, I read Tolkien's trilogy, and those creatures, elves, dwarfs, dragons, and the powers that they may have had. And you're thinking, I guess I'm asking is, 10 or 25,000 years ago, could there have been other civilizations where these myths and legends of creatures did exist, and simply 5,000 years of documented literature that we have, where was man's mind before that?
It's a really good point, Thomas, that if we have the psychological inheritance of monsters, but they are tied back to a time when we were really being chased by these giant creatures, then why can we make a similar argument of our other, sort of mythic obsession about other human-like creatures and tie that back into a date when there were giants and dwarves or elves and whatever?
Well, I think we can. The mythic imagination, I'm focusing on the predators, but the mythic imagination, when it developed, and there are arguments about when it developed. For an example, the brain spurt that occurred around 250,000 years ago probably was the brain spurt that pushed us into language and maybe into the mythic imagination. Now, we have hard evidence of this only in 40,000 years ago. We have sculptures that clearly indicate that we were able to imagine hybrid creatures. We were able to carve them. But the ability to think this way probably was much older than 40,000 years ago. And with the creation of the mythic imagination, we not only created monsters and were able to mythologize animal predators in imaginative ways, but we probably also generated beliefs in other kinds of creatures, other kinds of counterfactual and counterintuitive creatures, including ghosts and other creatures that were smaller, that we could not see that well, but that existed, elves, and a host of other counterintuitive and counterfactual creatures. So these existed probably for maybe 100 or more than 100,000 years. I just didn't focus on them, but certainly they would have been natural products of the same cognitive processes that led to the creation of monsters and other forms of mythic predators.
I want to, and then we'll get back to the questions, I promise, real quick. Thank you, everybody, for hanging on for Dr. Paul Trout. But that brings me, I think, in a way, to my Bible question. So I'm not trying to bait anybody here, and I just give me 30 seconds on this preamble, that we know that there are many people who believe that all of our human history is only 5,000 years old, roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years old, and that the Bible is as much a book of history and science as it is a book of inspiration or a book of guidance, and that it's accurate, and that there's everything that's right that is in it, and everything that's in it is right. So I'm a big Bible fan, but I look at the Bible differently. And my question is that if human beings, knowing what you know about our earliest ancestors, knowing what you know about anthropology and storytelling, if the writers of the Bible were living at the same time as dinosaurs or giant saber-toothed tigers, don't you think that would have warranted a mention in the Bible? Don't you think they would have been still processing that in the Bible, that every day they're facing giant crocodiles and eagles that are going to swoop down and carry them away, etc.?
Well, of course, they weren't living coterminous with dinosaurs.
Right. I'm just saying.
So,
but some people believe that they were at the time the Bible was written.
Well, that would be 5,000 years ago, and if that's, I guess I misunderstood. But
that's my whole point, is that they would all be at the same time. Wouldn't that have meant, knowing what we know about early human storytelling, that they would have been writing about being chased by T-Rexes and similar giant creatures?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. But there are mentions in the Bible of, for an example, I believe in Genesis, of the giants that came down from heaven and mated with females.
It's called the Nephilim. Is what it's called. The Nephilim, the fallen ones.
Nephilim. They're in certain depictions of Yahweh. Seem to go back to a time when, as I argue in my chapter called The Predator as a God, when the divinities that we worshiped had predatory traits, were first of all, I believe, predators, but then evolved into agents that were more human but still with predatory traits. And so I think that's the only way I can kind of answer that is to say there are some indications in the Bible of these beliefs that in fact, I mentioned a couple of them, these beliefs in dangerous animals and including gods being dangerous animals and having animal traits, and of experiences with, quote, giants. Now, I explain some of those in a more practical way by saying that we encountered the bones of dinosaurs. They, of course, were extinct for 65 million years, but people encountered their bones, their remnants, and really had no way of conceptualizing the concept of extinction. For all they knew, these were just bones of animals that lived elsewhere and had died there. So that there was a desire to mythologize these bones, and we might just see that in certain aspects of the Bible when they talk about the giants that existed before.
Okay. Alan is in Ogden, Utah, on Coast to Coast. Alan?
Yeah, hello, Ian, and hello, Paul. Fascinating conversation. I think this is one of the better ones on Coast to Coast for a while. The thought occurred to me that when we're speaking of monsters of the mind and the need to create or believe in those monsters, Coast to Coast is, of course, a great place for listening to those sort of stories. But what about the religious traditions of the, Abrahamic religions, but particularly the idea of Jesus or the Messiah, and also Satan or demonic forces as the monsters and the monster slayer?
Well, that's an excellent point. It's part of that same duality that exists from a very early age. Thank you, Alan. Go ahead. Paul?
Well, I touch on that in my chapter called The Predator as God. I argue that the first God humans worshipped were predators, and they were animal predators, not mythic predators. Predators evoked a host of feelings and responses that later came to be associated with all forms of worship of more human-like agents. And I believe that, for an example, the dread and the fear that we associate with the divine I think it was Otto's work on the sacred, where he talks about the fear that comes with worship of divine powers, and the fact that predators could evaporate into the woods indicated that they were somehow invisible and ethereal, etc., etc. All kinds of reasons for worshiping the predator, but eventually the human mind and human society demanded more from their gods than simply the fear that these animals evoked in them. And there was a chapter, I have a section called "From Predator Gods to Gods Are Us," and our growing sophistication as a creature, we wanted to identify more with agents, with a divine agent that was more like us, that could understand us and could sympathize with us, and that we could control in an easier way. And that is, I think that's how we get to the God of the Bible and of gods, in fact, of all religions. But we went through a phase where the God as a predator then was projected into the devils that we also had to have. And indeed, some gods, even in Aztec mythology, are almost both divine and devilish. But the devils became the old predator.
We're going to have to hustle if we're going to get everybody that's waiting. So let me just say, if we can keep our questions short and our answers short, we'll be able to get everybody in. Daryl?
Hi.
Hi.
As children, we probably read a lot of dinosaur books. We're very fascinated by them. And as I went to college, I started researching why China had their dragon, why there were dragon slayers in Europe. And then I looked in the book of Job. There's two dinosaurs mentioned. One is like a brontosaurus, and the other one is lives in the water and is fire-breathing. And you talk about ultimate predators. I wondered if you had any comments on that in the book of Job.
Well, I think we just did in a way, and I just don't want to get stuck on that topic, Daryl. I thought it was a really good point. I would refer you to the chapter on that, or we're just going to go back over that ground again. And I only because, and I appreciate your jumping in there, Daryl, but we just got 2 more minutes left. So let's see if we can get some other topics other than that one, which I think Dr. Trout just addressed really nicely. But it's a fair point. Let me get to John in Houston on Coast to Coast. John?
Yeah, Ian, quick question for your guest. Years ago, I had read a book, and in the book they had mentioned an incident that had taken place, I believe, in the 50s or 60s over in Africa. And in that incident, there was a French military aircraft helicopter flying over a jungle, and they'd seen a really large snake. And when they saw it, they wanted to get a better eye on the size of it. So the aircraft actually went low enough, and in doing so, they realized it was bigger than what they thought. They got some photographs of it. The snake, from what they said in the book, actually tried to bite the aircraft. The aircraft pulled up, but in the book they had a photograph of the snake. I was wondering if your guests had actually seen those photographs and if
totally
you knew about that incident.
I want to go look at them right now. Dr. Trout?
I have not seen that one, but I've heard of it, and I have seen other photographs from the 20s and 30s showing huge snakes. Unfortunately, they didn't always get their remnants back to civilization for testing by scientists. So that's really more for cryptozoologists to kind of work with. But yes, I have heard of these.
Well, it backs up the idea of just how big those snakes were back in the Pleistocene. And then, George, you get the last comment, but it's got to be a quick one. Go ahead, George.
How does all this relate to the Bearsark, the bear shirt, and the were phenomenon, where people take on the characteristics of their totem animals, and it may not just be mental.
Okay. All right. We just got to get a response based on that. Go ahead.
There are some people who actually now undergo surgical procedures to become a predator, to look like a predator. I'm hoping they don't act like one, but they actually go that far. this to me is another fear management strategy. You become you become associated with an animal in order to feel that you are a friend to it and that it is a friend to you. You're trying to implicate it in human interrelationships, and that lessens fear. It doesn't control the predator, but it lessens your fear of the predator, and also, of course, identifying with the predator is another way we overcome our fear of them.
Beautifully phrased. Nice way to end it. Deadly Powers, Animal Predators, and the Mythic Imagination. Boy, I'm so enjoyed this book and the conversation, too. Thank you so much for helping us understand us a little bit better. Might explain how everybody reacted on Black Friday, too. Very good. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll talk to you in the chat on Tuesday night. You Coast Insiders, Deus Te Amat, and I do, too. Mythology, and I know this touches on a sore subject for some people, but I do think it's interesting that we think of in Western Judeo-Christian culture, for that matter, Islam, that the discussion about the serpent, about that it was a snake, which was our adversary from the very beginning, and would be the something which was the adversary, especially for women, as laid out in the book of Genesis, and how that in other cultures it wasn't going to be a snake. It might have been a bear, or it might have been a jackal, or it might have been something else. But in our creation story, it's a snake. Well, hell, if they're 65 feet long. That probably explains. I mean, and they're silent killers too, which is the other part of this. Is so many of these beasts that you talk about, they don't give you any warning. There was no way of telling that, and suddenly you were alive and then you weren't, or suddenly you were there and then you were gone.
Python attacks on infants and children in Southeast Asia today are said to be almost too numerous to recount individually. So there is a very lively fear and a very grounded fear of these creatures. And I think you're right there. We even find some myths in the Arctic region that posit a dangerous agent.
Oh, and eagles, too. The eagles that are our national symbol. Maybe our ancestors wouldn't have used those as our national symbol. They might have held a grudge. We'll get to all that coming up next. Deadly Powers that shaped us next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Yeah, we'll get back to that. Coming up in just a few minutes, we'll talk more with Dr. Paul Trout about our current mythology and how it's been shaped by our years as prey. And that to this day, still around the world, we're still prey. Even in parts of this country, as Paul said, where you have to be very careful when you go out or you'll end up being prey. And it's much more part of our psychology. It is a formative force. And we're talking about how mainstream anthropology, maybe even psychology, doesn't give enough credit to our ancestors as having been survivors of being prey. They didn't walk on to the center stage of human history as apex predators. It took a long time, and we'll talk more about some of those predators. We'll wrap up our conversation about giant snakes, giant fish, and giant birds coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So, Dr. Paul Trout, we're just going to wrap up some of the other major mega predators of the Pleistocene era that we think, and you've convinced me, it's still lurking in our hard wiring, in our psyche, that we are this close to always end up being meat.
Of sensing danger, reacting to danger, and alerting others to danger. They didn't know quite what predator might be lurking in the bush or attacking them, but they would probably have developed some sort of squeal that meant very dangerous animal, and that this composite image actually, and he goes into a very sophisticated argument as to how this all occurred, was in our brains for millions of years. and that it manifests itself, this brain dragon, in art and in primarily art and architecture at certain times of cultural stress. So that for him, the image of St. George piercing the neck of the dragon, that dragon goes all the way back to the early Pleistocene, and it represents danger and threat of whatever kind.
Love this. As you're seeing already, we're tying in so much of what has already happened, what ended up getting hardwired into our brains, and then how it shapes us. And we'll get to more of that coming up next hour. Before we do, though, we got to wrap up with the other threats, the other people that are the other creatures that are part of the usual suspects from the Pleistocene era. So we'll talk about the big fish, and we'll talk about the big snakes. How big did those snakes get? And we'll talk about the teratorns and condors before we talk about how we got shaped.
Devices they'd use on forts to kill it with huge stones.
That's amazing.
So we've got the feeling that at one time the snakes, pythons, anacondas, boa constrictors, what I'm talking about, were immense. And we still, that might explain the especially frightening mystique that surrounds these creatures. We know that primates have a visceral fear of them, and we probably have something still left of that in our own head. In Mexico and Central America, they mythologize these creatures in huge, hundreds of gigantic stones carved in the form of snakes. And what's really interesting to me is that they are usually shown with open jaws, inside of which is a human head. This has now often been interpreted as the shaman emerging from the snake or wearing a snake skin, and that may be true to some extent, but I think it also captures the very practical realization that we often went down the throat of those snakes, and
Right.
Maybe a few escaped and lived to tell about it.
Well, but it's interesting that you should mention, I mean, the relationship between ancient creatures and even that realization itself, I think, is something which every human goes through. It's sort of like, oh my God, we're meat too. We're meat for somebody else, even though we aren't raised to think that way. So let's talk about the giant snakes of the Pleistocene, because I mean, we still have big snakes on the planet, but nothing like what they used to be like.
It's sort of still debatable how big they grew, because their particular bones, their skeletal remains are hard to find preserved because they're so fragile. But there was a finding in Egypt, and the snake skeleton measured 42 to 65 feet long. It's a little hard to know how much of it was compressed and found, but at any rate, between 42 and 65 feet long, which, when fleshed out, would mean that snake had a diameter of 18 inches and probably weighed 800 pounds.
Oh, my God.
Now, there are also reports from Roman armies of encountering huge snakes. Now, whether these can be credited or not is certainly debatable, but they were so huge that, one, they killed a number of soldiers until the soldiers devised battering rams and other